Okay, so you're the commander of Germany's submarine fleet in 1939, and your entire strategy comes down to one number: tonnage. Not ships sunk, not battles won. Tonnage, the raw weight of cargo capacity you can send to the bottom of the ocean faster than the enemy can replace it. Sounds simple enough. Sink more than they can build, and eventually an island nation that imports most of its food and fuel simply starves into surrender. That's the entire plan. And the story of how that plan actually worked, on paper, in spreadsheets, in monthly tonnage totals, and how it quietly stopped working in the space of about 6 weeks, is one of the strangest cost-benefit stories to come out of the entire war. There's a reason this story reads more like a business case study than a battle narrative, and it's worth saying up front. The German Naval Command genuinely ran the campaign like one: monthly tonnage targets, production quotas, a running tally of sunk capacity compared directly against enemy shipbuilding output, the same way an analyst might track a competitor's manufacturing numbers. Somewhere along the way, an admiral running the most lethal anti-shipping campaign in naval history started thinking less like a warrior and more like a supply chain manager, tracking whether the other side could outproduce his losses. Beat. Before you sink a single ship, you need to survive actually building the fleet. A single Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the entire campaign, cost several million Reichsmarks to build, comparable in relative terms to the price of several fighter aircraft rolled into one vessel. That number doesn't include what you actually need to run it: fuel for a patrol that could last 6 to 8 weeks, roughly a dozen torpedoes per boat, each one an expensive precision weapon with a genuinely unreliable track record early in the war, and the ongoing cost of maintaining bases, dry docks, and repair facilities along the French and Norwegian coasts once those became available. Every single boat that leaves port has already consumed a meaningful chunk of German industrial capacity before it fires a single shot. And that's the cheap part. The expensive part is the crew. Beat. The most expensive line item nobody put on a balance sheet. A U-boat carried around 45 to 50 men, and training even one competent submariner took the better part of a year. Navigation, torpedo operation, engineering, the specific choreography of diving, silent running, and emergency surfacing that keeps a steel tube full of people alive underwater while depth charges are exploding nearby. You can't mass produce that kind of experience the way you can mass produce a hull. A green crew with a brand new boat was measurably more likely to die on its first patrol than an experienced crew on an older one, which meant the actual asset that made a U-boat valuable wasn't really the steel. It was the accumulated competence of the specific men operating it, and that asset walked off the boat and could be lost forever the moment the hull went down. Roughly 40,000 men served in the U-boat arm across the entire war. By the end, close to 30,000 of them were dead, a casualty rate over 75%, the highest of any branch in any major military force in the war. Think about running any other kind of operation where 3 out of every 4 employees who ever clocked in were expected not to come back. That's not a cost you can write off as a line item and move past. That's the actual price of the entire business model, and it's the one number that never showed up in Berlin's tonnage charts. Compare that to the merchant sailors on the other side of the equation, the men actually crewing the ships U-boats were hunting. The U.S. Merchant Marines suffered roughly 9,500 deaths out of around 243,000 personnel over the course of the war. A devastating casualty rate in its own right, higher than most branches of the American Armed Forces, but nowhere close to the 75% figure facing the men doing the sinking. Both sides of this particular exchange were paying in human lives at rates almost no other job in the war demanded. It's just that the U-boat side was paying at a rate roughly 8 times steeper, patrol after patrol, for the entire length of the campaign. Beat. The revenue model. Tonnage as currency. Here's where the strategy gets genuinely interesting, because the income a U-boat fleet generates isn't money in any normal sense. It's tons of enemy shipping capacity removed from the board, and those tons only matter if you're converting them into something bigger. Forcing an island nation that depends on imported food, oil, and raw materials into economic collapse before it can outproduce your losses. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, who ran the campaign, did the math explicitly and revised it upward as the war escalated. Early on, his target was roughly 300,000 gross tons of Allied shipping sunk per month, enough, by his calculation, to outpace British shipbuilding capacity and slowly strangle the country's ability to keep fighting. In only 4 of the war's first 27 months did the U-boat fleet actually hit that number. Then, in December 1941, the United States entered the war, bringing its own shipyards fully online, and the target effectively doubled overnight to 700,000 tons a month just to keep pace. That's the equivalent of a company's break-even revenue target suddenly doubling, because a much larger competitor just entered the market with vastly more manufacturing capacity. Except the competitor here was the entire American industrial base, and there was no version of the U-boat fleet, however large, that could realistically outproduce that. Beat wolf packs, the tactic that maximized income and quietly built its own trapdoor. For most of the early war, U-boats hunted mostly alone, which limited how much damage any single convoy encounter could do. Donitz's answer was the wolf pack, coordinating multiple boats to converge on a single convoy simultaneously, overwhelming its escorts and multiplying the tonnage sunk per engagement, far beyond what any lone submarine could manage. On paper, this was a straightforward efficiency gain. Same fleet, same fuel, dramatically higher yield per attack. But coordinating a wolf pack required something a lone hunter never needed: radio communication. Boats had to report convoy sightings back to command, receive coordinates for other boats to converge on, and stay in contact throughout the engagement. And that radio traffic was the exact vulnerability that would eventually gut the entire campaign's economics. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been working to crack the German Enigma cipher used for those transmissions, and by early 1943, they were reading significant portions of U-boat radio traffic within about a day of it being sent, often fast enough to reroute entire convoys around a wolf pack before it ever made contact. On top of that, Allied ships and aircraft were being fitted with high-frequency direction-finding equipment, nicknamed Huff Duff, that could triangulate the location of a U-boat the moment it kept its radio on air long enough to coordinate with the pack. This is the structural trap hiding inside the whole tactic, and it's the exact same shape as a co-tenancy clause buried in a lease that nobody reads until it triggers. The very feature that made Wolfpack so much more profitable per engagement, constant radio coordination, was simultaneously broadcasting each boat's location to an enemy that had quietly gained the ability to listen in. You don't see this cost on the day the tactic is adopted. You see it months later, when boats that should have been perfectly positioned to intercept a convoy instead find escorts and aircraft waiting for them at almost every turn, because the convoy had already been rerouted around information the U-boats themselves had transmitted. Beat. The month the entire business model collapsed, to see how this actually played out, it helps to look at one specific stretch of the campaign rather than the whole war at once, the way you'd trace a single mall from opening day to demolition instead of talking about the retail industry in the abstract. By late 1942, the U-boat fleet had grown to its largest size of the war, and November 1942 became the only month of the entire conflict where sinkings actually hit Donitz's 700,000-ton target. From the outside, the tonnage war looked like it was working exactly as designed. Full occupancy in mall terms, a fleet that looked healthier than it had ever looked. Then, within about 6 months, the entire model inverted. Bletchley Park had broken back into the specific Enigma cipher U-boats were using by early 1943, restoring a steady flow of decrypted intelligence to the Allied Admiralty, just as convoy escort numbers, radar technology, and long-range aircraft coverage across the mid-Atlantic air gap all improved simultaneously. May 1943, a month German submariners themselves came to call Black May, saw roughly 1 U-boat sunk for every 2 or 3 days that passed, a loss rate so unsustainable that Donitz pulled the bulk of the fleet out of the North Atlantic almost entirely by the end of that month. After May 1943, average monthly sinkings collapsed to less than a tenth of the 700,000-ton target Donitz had set. The boats didn't get worse. The crews didn't get less brave. The economics underneath the entire operation simply flipped all at once, the same way an anchor tenant leaving can flip a fully occupied mall into a money-losing property without a single wall being torn down. What makes Black May such a clean case study is how little actually changed about the U-boats themselves in that window. Same hull design, same torpedoes mostly, many of the same experienced commanders who'd been racking up tonnage totals for years. What changed was entirely on the other side of the ledger. Escort carriers finally became numerous enough to close the mid-Atlantic gap where aircraft coverage used to run out. Centimetric radar let Allied ships detect a surfaced U-boat's periscope or snorkel at a range German receivers couldn't pick up. And decrypted Enigma traffic meant convoys increasingly weren't where the wolf packs expected them to be in the first place. None of these were secret weapons revealed in a single dramatic moment. They arrived quietly, stacked on top of each other, and the U-boat fleet's loss rate went from sustainable to catastrophic in the space of about 30 days without a single new type of German mistake being made. Beat. The competitor nobody could outproduce. Here's the part of the story that makes this worth telling as an economics lesson rather than a war story. Even at its absolute best month, the U-boat fleet was racing against an opponent whose production capacity it fundamentally could not outbuild, and the clearest proof of that sits in a single American ship design, the Liberty ship. These were deliberately simple, welded-together cargo vessels, designed from the outset to be built fast and cheap rather than built to last. Each one cost around $175 million and was originally expected to take about 5 months to complete. American shipyards, led by Henry Kaiser's operations on the West Coast, kept shaving that timeline down through sheer assembly line repetition, and by 1942, one yard managed to build a complete Liberty ship, keel to launch, in just over 4 days. A stunt timed deliberately for the newsreels, but built on genuinely compressed production methods that were running at scale across 18 shipyards simultaneously. Over the course of the war, those yards turned out 2,310 Liberty ships, an average of roughly 3 completed vessels every 2 days for years. Do the comparison directly. A U-boat took months to build and the better part of a year to crew with a competent team. and represented a single, irreplaceable asset that, if lost, took its trained crew down with it 3 times out of 4. A Liberty ship took days to build in the best cases, months in the ordinary case, and could be replaced as fast as American shipyards could keep welding steel plates together, which, by 1943, was considerably faster than U-boats could realistically sink them. The tonnage war wasn't just a tactical contest between submarines and convoys. It was a straightforward manufacturing race, and one side had access to an industrial base capable of outproducing the other by a margin that no amount of tactical brilliance at sea could realistically overcome once that capacity fully came online. Run the numbers side by side, and the mismatch gets almost absurd. American yards alone eventually produced Liberty ships at a pace of over 100 a month at their peak in late 1943, meaning the U.S. could, in theory, replace an entire month's worth of Donitz's most optimistic sinking target using just this one simplified ship design built in yards that hadn't even existed a few years earlier. Germany, meanwhile, never came close to producing U-boats or trained crews fast enough to keep pace with its own losses once those losses started climbing. One side was running a wartime economy built to lose ships faster than the other could sink them. The other was running an economy that had almost accidentally built the exact industrial capacity needed to make that trade a losing proposition for anyone on the other end of a torpedo tube. Beat. So did the U-boat fleet actually work as a strategy? The honest answer depends entirely on which years you're looking at, and the gap between the good period and the bad period is enormous. The exact same whiplash you'd see comparing a mall at 98% occupancy to the same building a decade later. In the early years, with weaker convoy escorts, no working code-breaking advantage for the Allies, and a smaller but more experienced U-boat force, the tonnage war genuinely inflicted brutal losses relative to its cost. Entire convoys gutted, tankers carrying irreplaceable fuel sent to the bottom. Real strategic pressure applied to Britain's ability to keep fighting. In the later years, once American shipbuilding capacity came fully online and Allied code-breaking neutralized the Wolfpack's core advantage, the same fleet, running the same tactics, against the same category of target, produced a fraction of the return at a dramatically higher cost in boats and crews. The asset didn't change. The economics underneath it did. A U-boat fleet looks from the outside like a straightforward math problem. Build boats, sink tonnage, win the war of attrition. From the inside, it was a business entirely dependent on staying one step ahead of an opponent's ability to both replace what was lost and listen in on how the sinking was being coordinated in the first place. And the moment that opponent caught up on both fronts at once, the entire model didn't just slow down. It inverted completely, and it took the better part of 30,000 men down with it. If a war that came down to shipbuilding math, instead of just battles, just rewired how you think about strategy, send this to someone who still pictures WOGA as pure firepower, and subscribe. Every week, another system whose real logic was hiding in the numbers the whole time.